I was absolutely a Toys R Us kid. I was a child of the 80s, growing up going to Toys R Us, and that never really stopped because then by the 90s I became an adult collector. My name is Scott ToyGuru Neitlich. I'm your host here on the Spectre Creative Channel, and I am a collector, a toy industry professional, and a parent. And with those credentials behind me, I want to talk about something very important today: the closure of Toys R Us and why it happened and what it actually meant for the toy industry. There's a lot of videos online and a lot of speculation, people blaming, online sales and, mass retailers, but that actually has nothing to do with it. And the reason that Toys R Us left us as a culture is actually pretty simple, but its effect on the toy industry are things that often aren't discussed. So let's just talk about the bare bones facts. And this is going to be a quick video, I hope, because there's not that many facts to talk about. Well, first off, in its last year, Toys R Us was profitable by $300 million. This is $300 million. But then along comes this guy, Bane. And we all know Bane, right? We remember him. He's the guy who broke Batman's back and was part of the Dark Knight action figure line from Mattel. Well, no, I'm not actually talking about this Bane. I'm actually talking about this Bane, Bain Capital. Bain Capital is a very large company that buys and sells other companies. And guess what? Bain Capital was straddled with a huge amount of debt. They took this on from various business projects that didn't go as well as they hoped, and they found themselves in the early 2000s with a huge amount of debt. Well, what did they do? Well, much like you can transfer your debt between credit cards, maybe because you have a better rate on one card or another, they purchased Toys R Us and then just transferred their debt to Toys R Us. As I said, Toys R Us made $300 million in its last year, yet it was forced to file for bankruptcy because Bain Capital gave it all of its debt when they bought it. That's why Bain Capital bought it, because they basically wanted to find a way to write off its debt by giving the debt to Toys R Us, and Toys R Us declaring bankruptcy. Now Bain Capital can keep going, and what happens to Toys R Us isn't really their concern because they now absorb their debt, they declared bankruptcy, and Toys R Us is off the map. But Bain Capital no longer has that debt. And that is exactly why Toys R Us went out of business. It had nothing to do with online sales or big box. So let's talk about the effect on the toy industry. I've often shown this 80-20% graph in terms of adult collector, but it also has to do with Toys R Us. Toys R Us skewed about 80% of the toys in the toy industry, whereas big box stores skewed about 20%. And there's a very simple reason for that: space. Toys R Us had a huge amount of aisle space that they could stock toys and sell toys. And their aisles were huge and long and big and tall. They had end caps, they had adjacent play set, they had the runway, which is what they called the empty space, that often had dump bins. But the bottom line is, whether it was action figures or building sets or art supplies or even baby products, Toys R Us had space. And that meant that they could carry a lot more toys than a simple toy aisle in a big box store could. And that gave them a huge competitive advantage because they could win when it came to selection any day. Yes, some places might be able to undercut them with a price, but when a child is asking for a specific toy, do you really think grandma cares if she pays $5 or $10 more? Not really. Toys R Us won the day because they were the ones who pretty much had everything in stock. You could go to Toys R Us and I'm not talking about obscure collector product, but for kids, more or less, you're going to find what you're looking for. And when Toys R Us was gone, more or less, you had sad toys that couldn't find a home. Toys that aisle space was no longer available for them because in a big box store, there's not as much space. A couple examples with Toys R Us is things like Playmobil. Playmobil in the US was pretty much exclusive to Toys R Us and mom and pop stores. And Toys R Us had a huge Playmobil aisle. They pretty much owned that business. And with Toys R Us closing, Playmobil has a very small area I've seen at Target, but it doesn't have the giant wall of Playmobil that used to be at Toys R Us. Another good example is Imaginext. Imaginext had 2 aisles at Toys R Us. 2 aisles. At Target and Walmart, they have 2 or 3 feet. Big, big difference. And that was a big reason Imaginext thrived, because they kind of own this huge amount of real estate at Toys R Us that was never going to go away. Because Imaginext, like other toys aimed at 4 to 6-year-old, really turns, has a lot of velocity, as they say. Another big one, the collector vector, one of my favorite aisles after I graduated from being a kid to an adult collector, where Target and Walmart have a collector area behind the TVs in electronics where they put a few collector items. Toys R Us had an entire aisle just dedicated to collector product. So again, they could skew a ton of stuff that just didn't fit in with other planograms, were one-off items. Maybe they didn't have a planogram, maybe they didn't have a strip of different items going down by price point, but it was just 1 or 2 items. Toys R Us had space for that. And the aisle space at Toys R Us let them have things like DC versus Masters of the Universe. Where would you fit this at Target or Walmart right now? I mean, would you shove it between the DC and He-Man lines? It's a wide package. It's hard to fit into a planogram. But Toys R Us could have items like this, which is why we were able to develop it for them. If you simply look at the planograms for large big box stores, and I'm not picking on Walmart or Target, I'm just using them as examples. Again, you'll see they carry tons of things for weekly visits, but you look at a planogram for Toys R Us and every single aisle is toys. Pretend play, games, seasonal. Star Wars had its own aisle. I mean, it just goes on. And that was not just what gave Toys R Us a good competitive advantage in the toy market, but it really contributed to pop culture. When you're at mass retail, the main reason you visit the toy aisle is to get a shut-me-up gift. Because you have your child with you, you need them to behave, and going to the toy aisle means they're now going to behave. The main reason you went to Toys R Us was to actually buy a gift, whether it's for your own child or your child's friend's birthday or a holiday present. You pretty much, if you were walking into Toys R Us, you went there with purpose. So how do we get Toys R Us back? I mean, is it about wishing for it to come back? Actually, that's not that far off, and I'm going to share something very personal in a moment with you. But I guess also what I'm leading to is getting Toys R Us or a major toy store back is so imperative for our culture and for our society, because children need a place to be able to go buy toys. Mom and pop stores are great, and I frequent them all the time. But again, they're not as big. They have limited aisle space. They want to try to have as much stuff as possible. Toys R Us and, even back in the early 80s, things like Child's World and other big box toy stores, had way more space. And as much as I love mom and pop, kids need to be happy. And that's the bottom line. And we're in a very weird time right now with kids at home and not at school, not getting the socialization they need. And this is going to affect children for years to come, like what we're going through in this one single year and season. The frustration kids have from being away from peers and having to learn at home. I mean, if you're blessed enough to have your child back at school, that's wonderful. That's where they belong. They need to socialize. But having children being happy in our society is just, there's no words to describe how important that factor is, because happy children lead to happy adults and happy society. So what can we do about this? Well, here's the personal part. I'm a firm believer that the universe will provide what you believe in and what you ask for. You may have heard this in book series like The Secret or, Think and Grow Rich, The Celestine Prophecy. I mean, there's a lot of books about this stuff, and they're actually all very insightful. Here's something personal. This is a note I wrote right when I joined Mattel in Hot Wheels. I wrote my goals of what I wanted to do at Mattel. I wanted to be the Motu expert at Mattel and the chief consultant on the He-Man movie. I wanted to get Motu toys made again through a direct-to-consumer or online stores. I wanted to create a direct-to-consumer program to sell Masters of the Universe and Justice League Unlimited figures. I wanted to expand direct-to-consumer offerings to other properties like Indiana Jones. That was actually part of my big pitch for Matty Collector when it happened, was doing Indiana Jones. I wanted to be the fan collector's voice for Mattel online for collectible toy lines. And I wanted to manage conventions and general fan relations, i.e. press, web, etc., to the fans. Now, this is all years before Matty Collector. I wrote this note right when I started with Mattel in November of 2005 and put it essentially in a wish box. This was when I was a copywriter with Hot Wheels, with no idea, how I was going to get there or that Mattel would even be interested in starting this kind of business. But it was my focus. I knew what I wanted to do. And by writing it down and focusing on it and concentrating and basically everything you do, keeping your goal in sight, it is astonishing how you can move the universe around. I love the quote from episode 1 when Qui-Gon says, "Your focus determines your reality." And if that means bringing back big toy stores or getting more collectors to work in the toy store, we can change this industry for the better and make more children happy. I hope you liked this video. I hope it was insightful. A like and a subscription are very much appreciated because that helps me tell YouTube that these are popular videos that they should share with more people. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. I'll comment back, and I'll see you guys in the next video.